Writing letters to Ogun, and he felt he could do something for Irish language learners, for Irish language readers. Agus rud George, it's my dearest wish to do something towards the advance of the national language. Of course, my efforts are still poor, but I could do a little to write a modest book of topical Irish stories which would help in some way the national effort. My book of short stories had been accepted, he said. I was in seventh heaven, but even better news was to follow. What other work could I do for them? Could I write short thrillers with a special appeal to boys, he asked. I must admit that they were not in for this suggestion. I would probably never have decided to make writing fiction my main occupation during the next few years. The seed was sown in that interview. I returned home and I created Rex Carlo, Private Detective. I made up my mind from the start to avoid intrinsic, clever plots. I always preferred the fighting bulldog Drummond to the learned Sherlock Holmes. When at school, I used to love the tales of Red McGregor, Trig McPhee, the Laughing Pirate, and Captain Q in The Wizard and Hotspur. So these were all English publications that he had read himself. I was hunnig sé go bhféadfadh sé acrish éigean in a bhurthad. In these stories, things just happened, and there was no necessity to explain why, as long as the reactions of these manly characters in certain unusual situations were conventional and natural. Rex Carlo would neither be scientific nor exceptionally clever, but I would make him a straight shooter and a hard hitter. The accent would be on adventure and not detection. So she thinks she's a lot of force. I look at this nishkir, the black shop. If we look back at possibly the English form of the detective novels, if they had a detective or their hero would visit a foreign country, he would often try to control the natives or the Cordoch Shishin. Ruby in Rex Carlo near Yen Shishin. So near Huig Rex Carlo Gadi Mars, agus Hasha lesh na Bunduchasli, the native people, the Marzipans that lived on Mars. He helped them rise up against the Deachtor Biakar. So we shave eerie goni better, Luchan and a Heron, Sirsha, Nascloch as a husband. So Kate Gawancha inside better as the core he sort, defining features of these stories, he made them Irish. How did he make them Irish? All his characters learned their Gaeilge, but also all other international people wanted to learn Irish. Being the Gaeilge on Tanka a bar, Aaron Downs.
First of all, there was myself and my sister were born in the 50s. There was only 15 months between us. And then there was a gap. 59, my next brother came along, and 63, my youngest brother came along. Dad, way back in the 50s, when his huge source of information was his shortwave radio, and he listened hugely to stories and history from Eastern Europe as well. And so he actually, I'm not sure where this gift came from, but he was fluent in the Russian language, fluent in Polish. He became fluent in all the Gaelic languages, Manx, Scots Gaelic, Breton as well. And when he was in the customs service, which he came out of later on, he was regularly sent to ports in Dublin to deal with if there were ships coming in from the Eastern Bloc countries. He was regularly sent down to speak to the captain about what the manifesto was. And he had a huge amount of influences. He didn't, back in those days, you couldn't travel very far, but you've only to see and read his stories that he had adventures in anywhere that a crime couldn't be solved. This ace detective, Rex Carlo, was called on and could go to Brazil, he could go to China, he could go to Dundalk. I'm surprised that he actually never came to Belfast for some reason, but I'm instead. So there were a huge amount of influences in his life, and of course what added to it all as well, and has enriched my life so much as well, is the connection with the border. Of course, nobody wanted the border way back in those days, but the connection. He was a customs officer on the southern side in Carrickcarn, the old main Dublin-Belfast road, and that's where he met my late grandmother. Was a very slim woman, but depending on what needed to be smuggled, she could gain weight or lose weight. And apparently it was on one of those expeditions to Dundalk when, I'm not sure what she was taking down, but it aroused some suspicions. And I think my dad took her, my late grandmother, and my mother off the bus to search them, whatever. And that's where it all began, all those years ago. And of course, my grandparents lived in South Armagh, in Killian, on main Dublin Belfast Road. There always has been that richness, and the intrigue of that has been just part of the backdrop of my life. And of course, a lot of Dad's writing was also influenced by his time there. And you mentioned earlier on the Sexton Blake series. Way back in the 60s, Dad was approached by the publishers of Sexton Blake to write a book for them. And back in those days, when he was writing his books, as a family, he would tell us the stories. So we had wonderful nighttime stories before going to bed. But he also showed us the illustrations that he would have done, which were later worked on by professional artists, maybe to develop the concept. And he told us about this book, Bullets Are Trumps, and it came out under the name Desmond Reed. And when I was living and working in Russia some years back, I was doing some research on Dad and on Sexton Blake, and somehow I found a contact in Britain of like a Sexton Blake fan club, and I wrote to them to explain that my dad wrote one of the books. And they came back to me very quickly to say that there were several books were published under the name Desmond Reed. Now, I only ever knew that Dad wrote one of them, but it seems the name Desmond Reed was like a flag of convenience that was used, but they approached different writers to write stories on their behalf. And that book that he wrote, Bullets Are Trumps, the style of the cover is very different to the style of some of these books here. And Dad could adapt his writing depending on the editorial slant of the magazine or book he was writing for. He also wrote for, back in the 50s and 60s, religious communities in Ireland were huge. So every religious community had their own publication, like the Imeldas, the Far East, the Word, African Missions. Dad wrote for all of these in the English language under totally different names. So one magazine didn't know he was writing for a different magazine. And depending on the editorial slant, back in the 50s and 60s, there was no such thing as love, and I won't mention any other conversation of that as well. But when Bullets Are Trumps came out, the cover for Bullets Are Trumps was quite raunchy looking compared to the image of some of these. Now, I don't remember him ever actually doing the initial artwork for it, but it gave him maybe a freedom to express himself in different genres that's probably quite unique. So it's quite amazing, because I've seen things up here that I haven't actually seen before, which is amazing.
Can I just ask, was he a full-time writer or a part-time writer? And
No.
When did he stop writing?
Oh, okay. Well, basically what happened, he was a full-time customs officer, and at that stage he had developed his writing career, and as a complete surprise, in the mid-50s we moved to Dublin, and we possibly had the only landline in the whole area. But Dad took a call from De Valera's office, who was Taoiseach at the time, and De Valera wanted to meet Dad and to speak to him. And of course, to meet such an iconic person was hugely important to him. And Dev was really impressed with the intensity of his writing. At that stage, he was also had a radio program every week, a topical talk, once a week on the radio. So he was very well known. So as a child growing up, that had benefits. It had a downside as well, because when it came to being in school, whenever it came to our Irish classes, the teacher would say, "You know all of this. you can go out if you want to. So like any young fella, more often than not, I actually went out of the class. I didn't necessarily stay in it. But De Valera proposed to Dad that the government at the time and himself, they wanted Dad to be seconded from the civil service to work full-time for government publications for An Cultúrlann. And possibly the sweetest deal that could ever be offered to anyone would be if anyone was asked to be paid for their hobby, we would probably all jump at the chance. And he loved writing, and he was offered this incredible deal that he would work full-time for government publications writing for them, and whenever his creativity might dry up, maybe after a number of years or whatever it would be, he was guaranteed he could go back into the civil service at the rank that he might have expected to be if he never broke his service. So you couldn't get a better deal. And Dad wrote for about 10 years for government publications. Then things did dry up, his creativity dried up, and he tried to get back into the civil service, and every possible barrier was put in his place at that stage, because new rules and regulations had come into place, and it was against that backdrop. I was in school one day, and the head teacher came into school. I was sitting down among all my friends, and the head teacher came in, and he was speaking to my own class teacher for a short while, whispering together. And then he came over in front of us all, and he asked us all to be quiet. And he said he had an announcement to make. And the announcement was that he'd read in the papers that Cathal Ó Sándair and his family were emigrating to Canada. I knew nothing about this. So this was a huge, but he wanted the class to all wish me the best and congratulate my dad on what he had done and wish him well with the move he made. But we never made that move.
There was a campaign in
Yeah.
papers to keep Cathal Ó Sándair in Ireland.
That's right, yeah.
He's our best writer, so we couldn't.
So like he would have continued. In fact, unfortunately, he passed away in 1996. But prior to that, influenced by the Chronicle of the 20th Century, which was a huge book that came out in the maybe late 80s or so in Britain, influenced by that, he came up with an idea of something similar called Learn Leinta, Book of Days, which was speaking about historical dates, religious dates, huge amounts of dates in Irish history, which he would write about. And the idea was that eventually it would be published. And within all his manuscripts, he always included other elements of other languages. So he could say, a lot of it would be written in Irish, then he might have a little piece of poetry it could be in Welsh, it might be in Russian, it might be something else. He loved the richness of Irish language, sitting comfortably with other languages and influencing them. And I think what's very important is I think the history of the connection between England and Ireland has been fractured, as we know, for a long time, and it has been good as well. But of course, he was born in England. His dad, my grandfather, was a British Army soldier who did his time in the British Army. My late grandmother, who was from Camden Street in Dublin, she lived over in Weston-super-Mare where they met. She wanted to come back to Ireland. So the family moved back in the 20s, and my late grandfather became an official driver for the Free State ministers. So there was always that sort of dual side of family history. And in some way, the same is probably for all of us, that we all have a connection with over there as well, and that had a big influence on him wanting languages to sit comfortably and languages for everybody.
Excuse me, where is he buried?
We had a huge dilemma as a family. My dad always said that when he passed away, he didn't want to be buried. Mm-hmm. And back in the 90s, there wasn't much of a tradition of cremation in Ireland. So so he died, and he was brought to a funeral home obviously after that. And it was some weeks later that we came up with this idea, my mum and the family as well, to go back to where their love story began, and that was mostly, it began in Killian or in Carrick, But when we moved to Greenore, that's where I came along. I was born in the house of Greenore. So we came up with this concept of bringing his ashes back to the sea in Greenore. And we did a lovely event there. So his ashes are out there in somewhere. He was quite a shy character. He wrote all of the time. He didn't have a social life. He didn't go out. Later on, when he passed away, there was an obituary, I think, in the Irish Times saying that he was a close friend of Miles and Agapoline, and they regularly were seen drinking in pubs in town, which he never did in his life. But there were colourful stories about him. But most of the time, he was at home within the family. He lived and worked within the family house. He had a bedroom converted into an office, and that effectively was his world, and it probably explains the intensity of the writing that he did all the time.
Yeah.